Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us this afternoon. We're going to go ahead and get started. We are very excited to be welcoming Diana S. Waite to do an author talk for us as part of our Preservation Book Club. For those of you who have managed to get a copy of this book, you know how beautiful it is, and it's just such a wonderful publication celebrating a very wonderful city, Troy. My name is Katie Peace. I'm the Director of Communications for the Preservation League of New York State. I'm assuming that most of you have found your way here because you are already familiar with the Preservation League, but for those who are not, I'll give you just a brief overview. We are New York statewide nonprofit that is focused on championing historic preservation in every corner of New York State, from Long Island to the North Country to Buffalo. And we do that through a wide variety of programs, including some technical services, grants, our 7 to Save program of endangered historic sites throughout the state, our public policy and advocacy program, our endangered properties intervention program loans, our Excellence in Historic Preservation Awards, which awarded this book an award last year. So we're excited to pull this into a new program through our Preservation Book Club. And we also do a lot of public programming like this, including webinars on historic tax credits, technical services. But as I mentioned, this is part of our Preservation Book Club program, and we are doing a series of author talks as well as book club meetups, and we're really excited about this new program as a way to have some new conversation about historic preservation with different people who are making that happen. So I'm going to introduce Diana S. Waite. She is the president of Mount Ida Press in Albany. She is the author of Ornamental Ironwork, 2 Centuries of Craftsmanship in Albany and Troy, New York. She's also the editor of the APT Bulletin, an international peer-reviewed journal on historic preservation. And she's going to be doing a presentation sharing some of the highlights from her research on the architecture of downtown Troy. She'll be joined after her presentation by Kathy Sheehan, who is the registrar at the Hart Cluett Museum in Troy. She's also the Troy City and County historian. Kathy and Diana have worked together extensively over the years, especially as Diana was doing the research for this book. So I'm sure we have a lively conversation to look forward to. But if you have questions that come up throughout Diana's presentation, please drop them in the Q&A box. And Kathy and Diana will try to get to as many audience questions as possible at the end. The chat box is also open for any general comments, and I'll be monitoring that. I also want to give a thank you to our sponsors, the Gary Trust, and to all of our members and donors who make programs like this possible. Thank you so much for your support. And not to take too much time away from Diana, that's it for me. I will be back at the end, but Diana, take it away.
Right. Wait a minute. Wait a minute, where am I going? Up here? To share this, I click that. Okay, so here. All right, so good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can see the cover of the book here. It's great to see so many people who are interested in learning more about the buildings of downtown Troy. And I wanted to thank Katie and Charlotte Worthy and their committee on awards for awarding this book, one of the Preservation Excellence Awards last year. This is, of course, the cover of the book, and it's a view from 1881. Troy is about 150 miles north of Manhattan, up the Hudson River. It's on the east bank of the Hudson. And if you can just pretend for a moment that you're in a hot air balloon, looking sort of southeast, this of course is the Hudson River. And I'll just point out a few places to give you a little orientation. This is the Green Island Bridge here this is really the north end of, looking north up the Hudson. If you were here, you would be looking north up the Hudson, and that is the Green Island Bridge. For those of you who know Troy, this is Washington Park down here. And this is the grand and wonderful Troy Savings Bank Music Hall. Oh, Okay, I am hoping my slides are going to advance, which they are not doing here. I don't know why that's happening. Just a minute. Just use these. All right. Okay, we're doing another system. All right, sorry about that. This is a map of Troy from 1818. And you can see on this what we determined we would use as the boundaries for downtown. So the boundaries really ran from Federal Street, which is here, south, almost as far as the edge of this laid out city plan. And then the hills here were the eastern boundary, and of course the river was the west boundary. I thought with this webinar today to not just run through things chronologically, because that is in fact the way the book is organized. So you can do that part on your own. The thought I had was that perhaps I could talk a little bit about questions that people have asked me about creating the book. People have wondered, for instance, how long did it take to write this book? And, how did I ever get sort of started on a project like this? It certainly was a long haul. It took over a decade. And I had been collecting information on buildings in Troy ever since I moved there in the late 1960s. And I had worked with local organizations when I was head of the National Register program for New York State Parks. And I worked on many publications when I was head of the Preservation League. And of course, now at Mount Ida Press, we deal with publications and historic buildings every day. So I didn't come to this without experience. I wasn't starting from scratch. Once we sort of defined downtown, and those decisions were made with what was then the Rensselaer County Historical Society, and is now known as the Hart Cluett Museum. So we developed a preliminary table of contents and a case statement for some fundraising for the book. And we were very lucky to get a large challenge grant from the Gary Charitable Trust through, of course, Hyler Held at that time. It was a matching challenge grant, and we more than exceeded raising money to meet that challenge. So then we really got started doing research on both images and documents. And I thought I could just give you a little overview here of the kind of archives that where we were able to find really great illustrations. This one is held right at the Hart Cluett Museum. It is a watercolor of the early version of the Baptist Church in Troy. This is sort of a strange source. This is the cover of a sheet of music that is in the collections of the New York State Library. This is the Cannon Building, and as you can see, someone is associating this march with the firemen's efforts to save the building. And I love this picture. This also is from the New York State Library, but this is a corridor in the Troy Hospital, which was built in the late 1860s with a nun, one of the nuns who were running that hospital at that time. We also used a lot of maps. This is a map from an atlas that is held in the collections of the Library of Congress. And this particular section has a nice illustration of Washington Park which is a private park in Troy, like Gramercy Park in New York. Only the inhabitants of the buildings around the park have keys to the park and are able to use it. And the buildings here along the south side of the park were in fact erected before the first buildings were built around Gramercy Park in New York. So it dates from the 1830s. This watercolor I also really love. This is by James Dakin, an architect who was working in New York in the 1830s. But this particular watercolor was one that we found when we were on vacation in New Orleans in the 1970s. This next document is part of the collection of the Hart Cluett Museum now. It is an actual receipt from James Dakin, the architect, who's acknowledging that he had received $150 as part of his services as architect for the church. And of course, Avery Library has many thousands of fabulous architectural drawings, and they have in their collection this one from the office of Richard Upjohn. This is the rectory, and it was erected in Troy. It was the rectory for the Presbyterian church. One of the things that we found very frustrating was that Green Island Bridge, which I had shown you on the 1881 bird's eye view. This was a major bridge. It was 1,500 feet long, but we couldn't find a good picture of it, or in the collections at the museum or anywhere. So one day I was at the Albany Institute. Oh, I'm sorry. Well, we'll go on. I was at the Albany Institute of History and Art, and I was looking at a Thomas Cole exhibition, and there was his drawing of Troy with, if you can see here, the bridge. Just go back, if I can go back for a moment to look at this snowstorm picture. This is a photograph from the museum's collection that was taken during the blizzard of 1888. We also commissioned a local architect, a local photographer, Gary Gold, who is based in Albany, works in many different places. But he did new photography for the book. This is one of his pictures of the Hart Cluett mansion. So he was able to do some interiors for the book. This is one of his shots of a building that originally was built for the Emma Willard School, is now part of Russell Sage College. And also he took pictures of industrial and commercial buildings. This is a view of River Street and these warehouses that were built in the mid 19th century. And then this large building here, which was built in 1888 and was the warehouse and offices for a Troy underwear company. So of course we were also looking for written documents, and I worked in many archives. One of the most important sources, of course, were minutes from the vestry or from the board of trustees of congregations of churches. And I was always very interested in looking for records relating to contracts as well as architects, of course. And what I found here in the archives of St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Troy was the contract for building that structure. And I had expected, it was signed by the contractors, and I had expected to find the name of the architect, but instead what I found was reference to how the contractors were to just follow the designs of Trinity Episcopal Church in New Haven, Connecticut. So I think, which is still there, but I think you can see the similarities with the Troy Church. And this is the historic interior of St. Paul's. This interior was later in the 1890s replaced with a new interior by the Tiffany firm. Troy is very, very fortunate to have had a man whose name was Arthur James Weiss issue several histories of Troy during the second half of the last quarter, I guess, of the 19th century. So he really provided a lot of very, very specific documentation on various buildings, and his books were well illustrated. This is just one of those many prints that were in his books. I also used manuscript collections in some New York archives, and this is, of course, the Troy Savings Bank Music Hall, and you see it here in one of Gary Gold's later photographs. And I guess it was already well known that this building was designed by George B. Post, the New York City architect and engineer. But while I was doing the research on that, I really found a lot of documentation about this building, which is known as the Rice Building or the Hall Building. It's a flat iron shaped building at the intersection of River and First Streets. And it is very clear from the records in the George Post collection at the New York Historical Society that this building was designed by Post also. For a long time, it was attributed to Calvert Vaux, but it really is by Post. So that was a very exciting discovery. Another thing that happened when we were doing the research on this project was that we were able to use an online source of newspapers that was that's called Fulton History. And it is really an extraordinary collection. One man, and a retired engineer, has scanned over 40 million pages of local newspapers. So it's possible to search them by word. And it really was sort of unethical not to take advantage of this wonderful source that came online. And it really delayed the production of the book because there was just so much wonderful material that was newly available. So what I was trying to do was to take all of this information, a lot of which had been, forgotten over the years or lost, and put it together to connect the buildings with the stories of people who had designed and constructed and, paid for the buildings. So one of the things that certainly became evident was that there was a lot of local architectural expertise, and you'll see more examples of this later, but this was an early example from the 1830s, a Presbyterian church that was designed by a man about whom I know very little. His name was Farquhar McRae. However, there were also a lot of these out-of-town architects who were working in Troy from at least the 1830s. If this is the Cannon building, you may remember the sheet music page that I showed you with the fire. This is that same building. And if you can imagine it without the later mansard roof, this building was designed as a commercial block by Town and Davis for Mr. Cannon. So that was, one example of an out-of-town architect. Davis also, Alexander Jackson Davis also designed this cottage called the Ida Cottage for a member of the prominent Warren family in New York. And this is really by an out-of-town architect. This is, as it says, the Troy Union Railway Depot. It was built in the mid-1850s. It was 400 feet long. It was one of the largest railway stations in the world at the time. And it was designed by a man whose name was Eugene Bonnet. He was a French architect. He came to Troy to live while this building was being built. It didn't work out so well. You can see here what happened, that a large part of the train shed collapsed after a snowstorm. Somehow, miraculously, no one was killed. Another example is this building. Again, if you can imagine it without the mansard roof. It was the, Quack and Bush dry goods store. It was designed by Henry Dudley, another New York architect. And it is very much like a dry goods store or department store built by in Lower Manhattan by Henry Dudley. This was built in 1854 and shortly after that. This picture depicts what happened in many the type of thing that happened in many American cities in the 19th century, a really catastrophic fire. The fire occurred in May of 1862. It took down hundreds and hundreds of buildings. You can see over here the one of the walls of the train shed. And it was, people just lost everything. However, what was also interesting to see was that in New York City, particularly, architects from New York City came to Troy immediately and set up offices. I mean, within days, they were advertising that they had, an office in one of the few surviving buildings. One of the reasons that things were rebuilt so quickly was not only because, there was architectural skill there, but because insurance claims were paid promptly. And the fire also occurred, as I said, in May. which was, of course, the start of the building season. So a huge number of buildings got underway very quickly. So there was a big boom in building at that time. There was another huge boom in the 1890s, and it just always strikes me that the streets must have been an utter mess here, especially 2nd Street, which is where this building was located. It was designed by a local architect, a very prolific local architect named Marcus Cummings. This was the Young Women's Association. He also designed these 3 buildings for Emma Willard School, and they are now, they all survive, and they are all now part of Russell Sage College. Across the street from these buildings at the same time, the county courthouse was going up, and this was done by Marcus Cummings and his son, Frederick. You can see the interior of the courthouse here. And at virtually the same time, the Troy Public Library the new library was getting underway. This was designed by, again, a New York City firm of Barney and Chapman. It was published in the American Architect and Building News, and you can see the 2 little floor plans up at the top of the picture, and I have enlargements of those. And one of the things that's very interesting about this building is the book stacks, and you can see them here on the ground floor plan and also on the 2nd floor plan. And I have a picture of them as they are still in place today. You can see that they're made of frosted glass and iron. And the manufacturer of these was the Westervelt company in New York. And this company actually used the Troy Public Library installation in their trade catalogs. At the same time that all those things were going up, there were 3 large houses on 2nd Street that were being either redone or built anew. If you see this building here on the corner, this was called the Orr House, and it was transformed into this building by an architect from Boston whose name is Langford Warren. Just not, very far away up the street, this building was also underway, and it was designed by a Washington, D.C. architect whose name was T.F. Schneider. It's commonly called the Castle by many people. For many years, it was a fraternity house. And this is a view of the original interior. This building may look somewhat familiar to some of you, the red brick and terracotta building. This is the Kemp House. And for years, there had been stories connected to this building with the firm of McKim, Waite, again, of New York. I finally found the name of the architect. It was James Bright, and he was, in fact, employed at the firm of McKim, Waite when Strivers Row in Harlem was being built. So I think if you know anything about Strivers Row, you can see certain similarities between this building and that row. And these, the Strivers Row, what I was trying to say is Strivers Row was underway when James Bright was working in the McKim and Waite office before he went out on his own. Another thing that was interesting but very sad connected with this building was that there was a newspaper story that mentioned how dangerous work on buildings could be. And when the cornice, the terracotta cornice at the top of the building was being installed, a 40-foot long piece of it fell off of the building and killed a young bricklayer. This building it's really just sort of a background building. I walked by it hundreds of times and didn't really pay very much attention to it. It was built, though, once we started investigating it, we found that it was the Mohawk and Hudson Humane Society building for Troy. It was, in fact, based on a New York City model. In this case, the Mohawk and Hudson Humane Society took care of not just animals, but also delinquent and neglected children. So the architect, who was Frederick Cummings, son of Marcus, went to New York and studied a recently built similar facilities, came back to Troy, used many of the features of the New York City precedent in creating this building. And there was even on the top, as there was in New York, a outdoor a roof garden, basically, for the children to use as a playground. A really important and very visible building in Troy is the Freer Building. And among the stories that emerged about this building as the research was being done is that there were many false starts before the owner really moved ahead with the building. He also shopped around shamelessly for an architect, and he finally hired a firm from Detroit that was headed by Mortimer Smith, and they were the architects. It has a fantastic interior, most of which survives. Most of the ironwork for the balconies and the stairways is still right there in place. This building, to me, sort of marks a change in the type of out-of-town architects who are coming to Troy. This is another dry goods store, and it was designed by a man whose name was Goldwyn Sterrett. His brother was head of the George A. Fuller Construction Company. And so the Fuller Company built this building, but Sterrett went on to become the architect of department stores in New York, such as Lord & Taylor's, Saks Fifth Avenue, and Bloomingdale's. This is a shot of the later railway station. It was done by Reed and Stem, who were in fact known nationally as the architects of railway stations. And there were some Albany architects who also were working in Troy. This is, as you can see, a building by Robert Gibson. It was the Troy Club. This no longer stands. It burned and then was demolished. And it's just a few years after Gibson had won the competition for the Cathedral of All Saints in Albany. and had won it over competition entry by Richardson. Another example of an Albany architect working in Troy was the Willett family. There were some brothers that worked together. This is the Rensselaer Hotel. And also another of their buildings was this YMCA building. Some of you may recognize this building. It was the Troy Record newspaper building, and it won an award from the Preservation League a couple of years ago for the preservation work that was done on this building. And then there was a lot of new construction, and it was been converted to apartments. This building was designed by Frederick Cummings, the Troy architect, and this rendering is actually by Hewson Hawley, who was a famous illustrator. Finally, I'm just going to show you this building, which is the work of Louis Milliman, again, a Troy architect. And if you didn't look at that large neon sign on it, you might think, it was a sort of an institutional building, perhaps, maybe a bank. And in fact, it was built by the Troy Gas Company. And I just find this so surprising. But if you look in here, they're actually have, gas and electric, I guess, appliances out for sale. There's a wringer washer up here also. And so anyway, today it is in fact a bank. So there were many people who were essential along the way with this project. At the Hart Cluett Museum, Kathy and also Stacy Hart from the Hart Cluett Museum were very instrumental and in searching for photographs and also for documents. Our staff here at Mount Ida Press worked very hard. Most recently, Liz Marsh was in charge of the images and many other parts of the production. And, you've seen some of the new photographs by Gary Gold. So finally, in 2018, the manuscript was turned over to our graphic designer, Connie Tim, whose business is the Market Street Group, based in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. And she had a really hard assignment, actually, because you can see how different the types of images we had to use are. But I think she did a really great job putting this book together and making it into a comprehensive, coherent whole. Meanwhile, SUNY Press became involved with the project, and we provided SUNY Press with the graphic design files. So we basically packaged the book for them, and they were responsible for printing and sales. And the Hart Cluett Museum became the co-publisher of the book. So looking ahead, there's much more to be discovered in Troy. There are many other, neighborhoods. It is even not an encyclopedia of the buildings of just downtown. There are many other very interesting structures. So Troy has changed a lot over the past decade. There have been many new people who have moved to downtown Troy or returned to the city. And I have even know of some people who have bought downtown houses as weekend houses. So far, the book has been enjoying really good sales. And if you're interested in getting a copy, they have them for sale at the Hart Cluett Museum, at our wonderful downtown bookstore, which is Market Block Books. And SUNY Press also accepts retail orders. So I think that's pretty much what I had in mind. So.
Hello, everybody. I'm Kathy Sheehan, here with Diana. We wanted to just probably chat a couple minutes. I think Diana really covered, well, certainly the main points, but as she was reliving these last 10 years, one of the things that came up for us on our part, Stacy Draper, our curator, myself, Doug Bucher, who is a preservation architect, the four of us met every month for the longest time at 8 o'clock in the morning. And it was really, we couldn't wait to hear what Diana had found as she was doing research in New York. She was down in Philadelphia, certainly, of course, resources over in Albany and here. And it was those discussions, I think, that were the most interesting to us. And I think you probably would agree with that, Diana, when you talked about some of the other unusual sources, like the sheet music. And remember talking about Mount Airy, and it made me think of a person I had been doing research on, the Talos, and coming across Julia Taylor's comments in her diary that we walked up the hill to go see Mr. Davis's new building. And, you know, so I think from our end, and certainly from my end as a historian, it was just wonderful to find out all these things. What do you think was your favorite thing that you discovered doing the research? What was the most exciting one for you? I have mine, but I know I want to hear what yours was.
Well, I may have given this away a little bit in the talk, which is the Rice building, or as I call it, the Hall building, that had been attributed to Calvert Vaux.
Right.
And when someone heard that I thought it was by post, they said I didn't know what I was doing. So to be able to prove that was very exciting.
Yeah, that was mine too, and probably the hardest thing along in of course in this process, once you had found that out, we all had to be quiet about it. and Diana was like, okay, I found this out, it's this, here it is, and she's showing us the documentation. Now you can't say anything because we can't give it away in the book. So I do tours, architecture tours downtown on Saturdays. We will start back up again in May, by the way, shameless plug. And you can go to our website and find out information. And so for a while, I had to continue that farce to say that the Rice building was Calvert Vaux. When deep down, also I wanted to go, no, it really isn't. But so I couldn't wait till we were released to give that information. So I think that was one of my favorite things too. How about the photographs? I wanted to tell you, we had this wooden cart.
Yes.
That I would drag down every month. And we were meeting, some of you may know our large meeting room, and I'd spread all these photographs out, and we would just go from table to table to table. And the running joke was, for all of our volunteers that worked in the library, is when are we going to be able to put the things away on the cart? And it went on, of course, for years. So, you know, we finally did, which was great. There were some questions that came up. Diana, what is the factory over on the island? It was in the middle between the Green Island Bridge and the west side of the river. That popped up pretty early on in your discussion.
There is there's a factory, or an industrial building,
right?
That's shown on the cover on that the island there, right by the bridge.
It's
That was Starbucks Foundry. They were making all kinds of iron products there, including sills and lintels for windows. And it was a very polluted site. And as everyone who commutes across that bridge knows, that there's a large residential development there now. With the
not named after the coffee company out in Seattle, right? If
Yeah.
you could speak to another question that came up was after you were discussing the May the 10th, 1862 fire, and someone said, well, I thought that all the buildings in Troy were brick at that time, but you had some interesting things that you discovered about once the fire was passed, about things like the cornices and the setback on the street. Could you speak to that just a little bit?
Oh, I have to try to remember that. I remember there was one story in the paper that was really promoting having iron cornices. Troy has a lot of brick buildings with wood cornices. So the flames would leap from one building to the other just between the cornices. And I also remember reading that the wood window sash got so hot it would sort of explode and spread the fire more. But there was certainly interest in more fireproof construction after the fire, and there were at least 3 buildings built with cast iron facades. Mm-hmm. For instance, with the idea that this was more fireproof construction. Yeah,
that was really fascinating. One of the little snippets that we had a scrapbook, I don't know if you remember this, that was a fireman's scrapbook, and I was going through that, and there was just this tiny little notice about a whole year later. I mean, talks to the intensity of that fire, and of course we know most of everything was rebuilt within 9 months, but there was this pile left over near Federal Street, and at the bottom pile there still was a hot ember, a hot brick, and they took it over to the Arbor Reed steamer firehouse. And here was 1863 now, and they were finally had that. The other question was, another little thing that popped up was that a lot of the debris was taken down in South Troy, down near the Burned Ironworks Museum, for those of you who know that, and they were using a lot of infill of where all this debris. Think of how many 800 some odd buildings, and where all that went to. A question came up about FultonHistory.com.
Yes, which Stacy talked about.
Talk a little bit more about that.
Well, we and I didn't do this research. Liz Marsh and other people who had worked in our office wrestled with Fulton history. The interface is difficult to use, but we used that rather than one of the commercial sites like Newspaper Archive or others like that, because this one had a lot more newspapers from Troy that were included. Also, there was no charge to use it. You didn't have to have a subscription, but I could really find fabulous things that you could never have the time to be able to afford in terms of money or just time to go searching for. And, unexpected things that happened that you wouldn't have a date, you wouldn't know when that cornice fell off the camp house, for instance. You wouldn't know to look for that.
I remember at the end of some years, the 1890s, when Edward C.E. and Edward Loth were doing a lot of kind of more vernacular housing and the 3-story, but they would list all the buildings at the end of the year that were built. There was a few years that they were doing that. It was in the Troy Daily Times. It's like, oh my God. And every time I drive down River Street, I go, oh, that was Loth. It's one of those things that certainly has made us all look at this book has made us all look at architecture in so many different ways. A question came up is, what was typical facade materials and where were they sourced from?
Well, they really were brick, as someone, I guess you had said, Kathy. I mean, most of them are brick. Of course, there's the wonderful example of the Hart Cluett Museum itself, which is marble fronted building. And there were a couple other buildings that were had marble facades. But I mean, really, it is a red brick, city. I mean, there are other examples like the courthouse and the library that are white buildings and not red brick buildings. The brick was most likely, just Hudson Valley brick, but there were local foundries that were doing cast iron components.
Mhm.
There was the Mahoney architectural iron. There was an architectural ironworks.
Yeah.
So
Mahoney being one of the most wonderful ones. Yeah.
yes.
Mahoney Ironworks, great.
Right.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Right here. One of the other questions, where are where's the next, where the next book page is going to go? Where's the next area of the city that you may concentrate on for another book? Looking to the future?
My interest was really downtown. And so that's what I was interested in. Someone, and I don't think it's me, it needs to do a book on houses in Troy. I mean, that would be a really interesting
Mhm.
thing to do. But I don't know. I guess I was more interested in the public and institutional building, so that's what I sort of focused on. But there, as you said before, there are all these different neighborhoods in Troy, the neighborhoods up the hill that, can be make a wonderful story too.
I had looked at some of the Q&A stuff on the chat. Mr. Mark Warren says, it appears many of out-of-town architects were attracted to Troy. Do you know if that was the case with similar small cities upstate, or was there something unique about Troy?
That's a very good question, Mark. I don't know. You have to ask, I guess, the local historians, what
I think I'm jaded. I think we are unique, but
it was easy to get to New York. It was easy to get back and forth. There's long history of exchange of ideas and fashions and so on.
Yeah, I think we had very sophisticated taste here very early on in Troy, for sure. Yeah. I think those connections to New York City and Washington and everywhere else. Samuel White comments, wonderful material. Could you give us a 2-minute summary of the economic engine that make Troy go? How diverse was it? Ooh, that's, I think, longer than a 2-minute summary.
Okay, Sam. Well, Troy was, once a really industrial giant. Its products were sold all over the world. Its bells. In fact, we found a bell the last time we were in Cuba. There was a bell that had once been associated with one of the sugar plantations then the bell had been made in Troy. And cast iron stoves were sold the world over. So there was a lot of industry here. There was a lot of money here. Maybe Kathy would like to add to this.
Yeah, I think you covered the 2-minute summary pretty quick. I mean, it's more complicated, obviously, but that's a good that's a quick answer. In the picture of the fire, there's a large building on the hill in the background. What is it? Is still there? I'm assuming he's talking about the Troy University.
Oh, on the hill, yes.
On the hill.
Troy University. Which was in business for only a couple years. I mean, it was sad. They built this huge building and then it faded away. I mean, it just didn't become a success. And was then used by other bodies for a while and stood until what, Kathy?
Early 1970s.
60s or 70s, really?
Yeah, early 70s. Yeah.
Oh,
I think Doug Booker said he was at RPI when they were taking it down because he was in there.
yeah, Jack remembered that also.
Somewhere around 1970, I think. Somewhere, yeah.
So it was used by RPI.
Right, right. You mentioned the building campaigns after the 1862 fire and another one in the 1890s. Were there other large building campaigns?
Well, in the early 20th century, there were, there were a lot of buildings built at RPI, for instance, and a big, firehouse and signal station, and sort of a civic sort of
right. Well, and all the schools in the 1920s, and yeah, that was what I was thinking about, all the schools and things. There's a reference among A.J. Davis correspondence of having designed a house for Nathan B. Warren in Troy. Are you aware of this house, and is it still extant?
It was the cottage, the Ida Cottage picture, that little sweet Gothic building that was built for Nathan Warren. No, it's not still standing. It became huge. They added onto it over the years, but then what, Kathy, do you remember what happened to it? Did it burn? It was part of the park.
Prospect Park used it they called it the casino and kind of a museum type building, and then it was kind of abandoned. My dad remembers it burned down. They finally tore it down in the 1930s. But the one part of that does exist is the gatehouse, and that was at the foot of the entrance going into Prospect Park. And it was actually rolled up the hill on College Avenue. It still sits there. It's on the edge of the RPI campus, and they kind of watch it. I guess they take care of it. So they take care of. They've painted it, and I think some of the emergency services are in there. It's a wonderful tiny little building, but it's great. Let's see. Downtown Troy seems to be relatively intact. What enabled its survival, or are there really still challenges? Is there a Main Street program or local preservation group that promotes revitalization? Is the downtown protected by a historic preservation commission or facade grant program? That's a lot of questions.
Well, yes, there is a historic district commission, and there are National Register districts downtown as well as local districts. And I'm forgetting the first part of the question.
Oops, it just popped away.
But it's intact. Why was it so intact?
Still.
Well, one reason was that urban renewal programs were sort of late to take hold in Troy. However, they did, and there were acres and acres of houses, particularly, as well as commercial buildings that were demolished.
Right. Yeah, let's see. Troy has two important synagogues. Have they both survived? Can you talk about them? One is in the book. Aren't they both in the book?
Yes, there's an original picture of one of them, and a new picture that Gary took of the same one. I think we didn't include the other one. Is it too far south? But it sits by itself.
Beth Tefla, yeah, Beth Tefla, and then Baruch Shalom.
Yeah,
on 3rd Street,
below Russell Sage College.
Right. Let's see. Oh my God, did Barney and Chapman design anything else in Troy?
Not that I know of. I don't.
Okay. Someone. Richard wants to say, great job, Diana. Could you say a few words about the Troy Gassholder building?
Oh, well, this is a building that's not in the book, but which I had done a little book for Hudson Mohawk Industrial Gateway. It was, it's the brick shell that stands. It's a round building. Was it 2 stories high, and built of brick, and inside were two, at least two cylindrical tanks, one of which sat on top of the other one, and illuminating gas was sent in there, piped into the tank, and the upper tank would move up and down according to the amount of gas that was in the that was available for gas lighting. And it still survives.
Still survives, right?
Yeah.
Ah.
All right, I think we're just about out of time. If you want to do maybe one more question, and then we'll wrap it up.
Just very quickly, the gatehouse on Ida Cottage is on College Avenue, College Street. Does the Rice Building have tiles in the facade, Diana?
Yes, it does, and they were encaustic tiles that were imported from England. Yeah, very intricate facade.
Okay. It's all yours, Katie.
Hey, thank you so much for that. That was great. I hope that for any of you in the audience who maybe have not been to Troy before, that this inspired you to make a visit at some point. It really is a great city with lots of great architecture and all sorts of fun things to do. So I hope Diana and Kathy inspired you. Thank you both for being here, for sharing your expertise. Diana, I know you spent a lot of time and energy on this book, and it really shows. If anybody hasn't picked up a copy yet, I definitely encourage you to do it. It's a beautiful book. Support a local bookstore if you can. And a few people asked about whether there'll be a recording of this, and there will be. It will be up on our YouTube page within the next couple days. It's also on our Facebook page right now, so you can watch it if you want to revisit it. For any questions that didn't get answered, I'll take a look through them, and maybe we might be able to do a blog post or something. But thank you all for joining us. We really appreciate you spending your afternoon with us. We have another author talk coming up on March 4th with Roberta Brandes-Gratz, who will be talking about her book, It's a Hell of a Town, with Anthony Wood and Amy Freytag about the J.M. Kaplan Fund. So you can find information about that on our website. We hope you join us. We're also reading The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson this month as part of our Preservation Book Club. That'll be a traditional book club meetup, so we're meeting on March 11th to talk about that book and how the Great Migration has helped build New York and America as a whole. So please join us for that if you are interested. We have lots of other great programs coming up. All of it's on our website. And I hope you will join us for some other thing in the future. We really appreciate you spending time with us. And if you ever have questions, we are here for you. Please get in touch. Thanks again to our sponsor, the Gary Foundation, and to all our members and donors who make programs like this possible. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Katie.
Bye-bye.